Hello and welcome to another episode of Her Entrepreneurial Rise, the podcast where we amplify the stories of women and gender-expansive leaders using entrepreneurship as a force for social change. Because their stories aren't just inspiring, they're blueprints for what's possible when equity leads the way. I'm your host, Kelen Tamurian, and I'm honored to introduce today's guest, Ada Williams-Prince, a visionary leader in global and domestic philanthropy, known for disrupting traditional funding models and advancing the economic power and mobility of women and girls of color. With more than 2 decades of experience in humanitarian and development work, Ada has dedicated her career to designing scalable, equity-driven strategies that reimagine how philanthropy trusts, funds, and partners with communities. As the former director of program strategy and investment at Pivotal Ventures, an investment and incubation company founded by Melinda French Gates, she championed the formation of the first Women and Girls of Color Design Council, envisioning a future for philanthropy that leverages the wisdom, experience, and collaborative capacity of women and girls of color to design and implement meaningful solutions to real-world problems. Through her leadership, Ada has shown us that investing in women and girls of color is catalytic, unlocking possibilities for entire communities. I'm so excited to speak with her today, and I know her story and her vision for reimagined philanthropy will challenge us to rethink what capital can make possible when power is shared. So with that, let's dive in. Hi, Ada. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's just kind of get right into it. You describe your work as the design and curation of global philanthropic and capital strategies for liberation. Why is it necessary to reimagine philanthropy as a tool for justice?
Well, I think one of the reasons is because philanthropy in and of itself is not supposed to really exist. I think philanthropy has always been in the way that it's traditionally done right now. I think if we think about who is a philanthropist, we have an image in our head of either a very rich white person who is giving charity to a very poor person, when in fact philanthropy is just love, and it's love of your fellow human. And I think, in my community growing up, you know we did a lot of philanthropy, but we didn't know that that's what it was called. We took care of our neighbors, we took care of our community. A lot of the things that we did were shared amongst the community. And so I think if you look at the trillions of dollars that are sent overseas to families in remittances, they're called remittances and not philanthropy. So I think it's reframing what philanthropy really is and who is called a philanthropist. And so I do think that honestly, the way to think about writing the ship here in terms of that term is really thinking about, whose land we stand on in the United States and globally, and what that means, whose people were stolen from their lands and brought here to build the United States. So I think if you think about that, philanthropy is one thing, charity is another, and then it's in the pursuit of justice is a wholly different mindset and frame to think about within the context of philanthropy. And really what you want is a system that does not continue to oppress people and keep people in these unequal and inequitable positions. You really want to work yourself out of a job. Nonprofits are not supposed to continue to provide services for to end poverty. The idea is to end it, right? So I think that's something to really consider when we think about philanthropy. It is certainly not something that we want. We want to actually shift the power so that it's not about people who have money giving money to those without. It's about an equal and just system.
Yeah. I love what you said about philanthropy being love. It reminds me a lot of something that I learned in a disability justice class that I took last year, where we learned about the concept of Ubuntu.
Yes.
Is derived from African cultures, and it really is that idea of I am because we are all part of, we share common humanity, and communal care is how we grow and support each other. And it is not designed to be, okay, this person has power because they have money, and so they're going to offer it to this person of less status and less power. And that doesn't facilitate that idea of communal care. It does continue to perpetuate those inequitable positions that you were describing of, if the goal is to end poverty, And like you mentioned with nonprofits, the continued work of nonprofits should not necessarily be to continue to provide services
That's right.
to, to end poverty. The goal should be to end it. And that starts with really reframing what philanthropy is, that it's communal care, it's love, it's not what can I donate to you, it's how can we work together to devise a world that is actually truly equitable and ensures that everybody has what they need to feel supported and to thrive. And so I really love that perspective that philanthropy is love, and I'm definitely going to take that with me. And I think that really kind of moves well into the next question that I had for you, which is that despite the fact that women and girls of color make up 1 in 5 people in the US, only about 0.5% of philanthropic funding is directed specifically to them. And too often, when funding does reach their communities, the solutions are designed without their voices at the table. You
Hmm.
helped ideate and champion the Women and Girls of Color Design Council at Pivotal Ventures as a way to reimagine that process, ensuring that women and girls of color are not just funded, but trusted as co creators and leaders of solutions. Can you talk more about why you felt so strongly about building this design council and why co creation is so critical in the development of equitable philanthropic strategy? You spoke to it a little bit already, but I'm curious to kind of dive in a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think that the main tenet of this idea is about the actual way that we think about problem solving. I think the majority of the way that foundation and philanthropic strategy gets built is that it is built by those with power and funding. It's not built by those um, who are the people who get the benefit of the funding. So, for example, I would say we don't often think about designing and the design of things when we're designing roads. It's really about that idea of public discourse and the public being responsible for their own solutions to any of the problems that they might have. So the people who are closest to the solution can solve their own problems. And it's that kind of trust and that kind of understanding of power,
Hmm.
and who has the power to decide, and why does it have to be the people who are in power and have the money? How is it that they know better than me, who is living in poverty,
Hmm.
what the solution is to my issues and my problems? And so the design council of women and girls of color was really shifting power to communities to design their own solutions, of which they are the experts on their own lived experience, and
Hmm.
they have the solutions. And so it was trying to flip the idea in private institutional philanthropy, which is much more community foundation focused and much more community focused. You have it a lot in government, where they do community budgeting, participatory budgeting, and it is centered around the community. And so bringing that to a place like Pivotal Ventures, where I would say the majority of foundations and philanthropy, usually the way they design strategy or figure out what they're going to invest in is they go through a process where they bring in consultants, or they have other people go through a lengthy process of deciding what the problem is through research and through sometimes consultants who come in and basically use a deficit model to determine where the gaps are. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to determine what the gaps are, but the frame and the mindset of deciding purely based on deficit and not on the assets of communities really gives you a skewed view of what to invest in. So I realized that the only way that we were going to get to impactful shared power and leadership of women and girls of color who are most powerful in their communities. And we are missing out on innovation and impact when we don't actually focus on their power and their solutions as experts in the field, as leaders, particularly young women. And girls of color in their own environments, and they have the expertise. So, in order to do that, I had to build a strategic case grounded in both values and pragmatism, and I had to position myself as someone who could uh deploy those resources effectively. That is the reason the design council existed, was really to make sure that the impact of what the philanthropy dollars was trying to affect, that if you really want demonstrated impact, it required, if you say you want a world, a just world that is equitable for everyone, then you have to go back to the design of the thing. I heard this once and I say it all the time. When we think about design, Angela Glover Blackwell wrote this amazing piece in SSIR about how public policy has shifted over years. Like, what is the reason we built, the streets have a curb cut? She calls it the curb cut effect. The reason there's a small dip in curbs when you cross the street is because it was originally designed for people in wheelchairs. But who it actually impacts are moms with kids in strollers, kids on bicycles. So if we design the world where we are thinking about the least of us or the most invisible people, it impacts everyone in lots of different ways and it benefits everyone in lots of different ways. And that's how we should be designing the world.
Hmm.
And so that is what I think the power of the Design Council for Women and Girls of Color can lend itself to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as a gender, women, and sexuality studies student, that idea of going to the communities that are experiencing oppression and bringing them into, they are closest to the solution. Their lived experience is data for this is what needs to be done to be able to allow us to experience a reality where we actually have what we need and we can feel safe and secure and able to exercise our brilliance elsewhere. And I think it almost, to me, I'm like, it sounds so simple. Why would they not be included in the solutions that we're devising to these big systemic injustices? But
Right.
like you said, that's not the way that the typical philanthropic model works, and that's not the way that a lot of even, part of the ethos of this podcast is talking to women and gender expansive leaders who are leveraging their own lived experiences to build solutions to the systemic problems that they see in the world and that they've personally experienced. And because I recognize that, like, that is when the most innovative and most impactful broad scope solutions are created. Because, like you said, that when we're thinking about designing solutions for individuals at the proverbial bottom of the totem pole, even though I don't like thinking about it that way, but
Yeah.
if you design solutions for those that are the most that are experiencing, intersectional oppression and are experiencing the
Right.
most oppression,
Yes.
that solution necessarily benefits everyone because it serves every single person that is affected by every single aspect of that intersectional oppression that that person at the bottom is experiencing. And so I think it makes so much sense. And I think that if we could get the rest of the world on board of recognizing, like, this is how this is supposed to happen, because
Yeah.
this is how innovation that is long lasting and that actually meets the needs of the communities and society writ large, but it meets the needs of the communities in need, I think we would be in such a better place and we would be able to have the just world that we keep talking about that we want,
Hmm.
but we're not actually existing in yet. So I really appreciate your perspective on that. And I think that it's one that really needs to be adopted across the.
Yeah. What I realized that I didn't say what I was going to say, what I heard, and I use it all the time is when we think about design, somebody said, like, I know there was no woman in the room when they decided to call the iPad, right? Like,
Mm.
who would, like, you're missing something
Mhm.
when people who should be in the room are not in a room. And so we just adopted it. We're like, yeah, let's call it the iPad, right? Like, nobody in that room has a menstrual cycle who could be like, really, you want to call it why don't you call it a maxi pad then? Like, there's no sense in design. The people who are the most powerful get to decide,
Mhm.
and I think the people who are the least powerful should be the ones to decide
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that the more, and we hear this all the time, we want diverse perspectives to create the most innovative and impactful solutions, but that diverse perspectives, whether it's just, bringing women into the room or individuals that are non binary or individuals of color, like bringing in anybody and everybody into the room that should be there is not common practice. And so those diverse perspectives that we say that we need, we're not actually getting, and being able to, like you said, design solutions that actually make sense for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the next question that I had for you, we kind of dived into it already, but I am curious to maybe hear one of the initial question that I had for you was that given the compounding realities of racism and sexism that women and girls of color face, why is directing resources to these communities catalytic not just for them, but for society at large? And we spoke to if you are directing resources and allowing communities that deeply understand the problems that they're facing to be co-creators and architects of the solution to the oppression that they're experiencing, that
Hmm.
it betters the world for everyone. But I'm curious if there might be an example of how that actually worked in practice during your time at Pivotal Ventures, where those resources were directed to a community of color or of women and girls of color that really created broad scope impact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess what I would say about that is it was a journey. I originally started with building an adolescent mental health portfolio there that centered equity and particularly young people, gender expansive young people, and LGBTQIA plus young people and girls of color. Like if you center equity, it means you center all of that, the
Mhm.
intersectional nature of working on mental health is and access is was the first part of that, and then bringing everybody along on really having a an intersectional lens to everything about the whole organization, but particularly around investment and funding meant that it meant that it was a long journey, right? Like it was about, you have to build the business case in language that funders understand. And it was about justice and equity, but also it was about framing it as, risk mitigation and strategic allegiance. And it was like, understanding that what I said before, that there's the people who are best positioned to deliver the impact that you seek, right? Where it's catalytic investment that are women and girls of color are leaders themselves. And if you don't have them design at the design table, it's not just that it's wrong, it's strategically incompetent. Like you're not going to get the wins that you seek. So it's kind of like a risk to your own, to your brand, right? So
Yeah.
that there's a piece about that. And then there's also how the cost of doing the same thing, right? The cost of the status quo, right? There's data on people missing opportunities, funding the same things over and over, the failed initiatives and the resources wasted on solutions that didn't work because they weren't designed with the right expertise, right? So that also helped. And then I think if you position something that's both morally necessary and strategically smart, refusing it requires admitting that you actually don't care about justice or you're comfortable with an ineffective strategy. And I think at the time it was not possible to say that out loud. And I think that you have to, and then in that moment, really showing up as this is not just about, a fun thing to do, or that you were doing it because it was a brand thing. This kind of work can't be done alone, and it certainly can't be done from inside institutions. So it also meant that you had to bring people from the outside in and show that, here's what other people are doing, and here's how you're behind the curve as well.
Mhm.
And having allies and people who can show that they show bold support. So it was like bringing other people in to say, we're doing this over here. So making them feel comfortable taking those types of steps. So I had to bring in people like Angela Glover Blackwell and people who were working on this, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And, so it was a lot of bringing people in to help feel comfortable with the journey.
That was really valuable. And I think that your perspective on it is necessary to communicate the quote unquote business case for justice and for equity, because it isn't beneficial strategically to not include women and girls of color or individuals from multiply marginalized identities at the table when you're designing solutions for innovation in various sectors. It is a measurable loss that you can point to, like you mentioned, of what you are standing to lose as a business owner when you're not including those diverse perspectives at the table. And I think that your point that not only is it morally incorrect not to have everyone whose voices should be shared at the table, but is that it is strategically not smart. And being able to present that to business owners and saying, like, this gives you the opportunity to admit or to, sideline whether or not you actually believe in justice and in equity. And hopefully, nobody wants to admit that they don't feel that way and that they don't want to create a more just world. And so I think sometimes it can almost feel a little bit icky to be like, why do I have to prove the business case to you? Like, it's just the right thing to do. You should just do it. But I think it is important in the sense that there is literal data to show that, like, the solutions that we create when everyone is involved, everyone who is impacted, everyone who has lived experience to contribute is included in the development, the solutions that we create are so much better. And so I think all of what you said was so valuable and something that I'm really excited to be able to share with our community here at UW and beyond, because I don't think it's a perspective that's shared enough.
Well, and I think I could add to that about like it's it's also something that you have to be all constantly curious about. Like funders care about impact, effectiveness, innovation, and risk management, fine. But it's also how you frame trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant making in different terms. You can talk about the transformative impact. You can talk about getting results when communities lead their own strategies. And you can talk about if you want innovation, then you have to fund some things that where communities say that's what they need. And so I think some of the ways in which I have done that is also looking at data, but also saying data matters, but stories move people. So
Mm.
how we sharing examples of what became possible when we shifted power, grants that created ripple effects, leaders who've emerged, movements that have been accelerated. So being able to also name what's happening, I don't shy away from, power, oppression, extraction. Like you're using them, but you use them precisely, not as
Hmm. Blanket
buzzwords.
terms. Yeah.
So that it allows them to also come in. Some people are moved by justice, some people are moved by pragmatism, but I think most people need both. And you have to acknowledge that shifting power isn't easy or painless for those who hold it.
Hmm.
So I was very explicit about like this is going to require you to give up some control. You will feel vulnerable. And when we first started with the design council, everyone started off by saying, they're not going to make any decisions, are they? Or they're not going to da da da. So it was very much like controlled. It was very controlled. But over time, seeing and building trust, it changed. The discomfort was a part of the process, but you become more comfortable as you see and trust the process, as you see what's happening. People respect honesty about the difficulty more than false reassurance. And so I think that's what helped get it all over the finish line, and also helping people imagine a future that is bright and beautiful, right? So imagine what becomes possible when we do this is more compelling than saying, you must do this, right? So I think you invite people into possibility rather than beating them over the head with demanding compliance. And so that's really how you make people want a future that they can participate in.
Hmm.
And that's really I am a futurist, and that's what the Women and Girls of Color Design Council represented. It represented a future for all of us. And I think when you provide people with this beautiful future and imagination, and they walk with you on that level, they want to be in it and they want to do more of it. So we just don't, as the older we get, the less creative we are with our imagination. And
Hmm.
it is the only thing that will future proof everything that is happening right now today. It is our imagination. It
Yeah.
is our imagination and thinking about what is possible in the future. And we've lost that, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, from what I've gathered in learning more about your work today, I really do see it as that vital reimagining of how philanthropy can function as a tool for liberation. It doesn't start with a top down model of charity. It starts with an intentional shift in the power dynamics involved in philanthropic work, trusting the leadership, like you mentioned, trusting the leadership of women and girls of color, and building strategies that are designed with communities rather than for them. And through efforts like the Women and Girls of Color Design Council, you've shown how co creation can unlock solutions that are more equitable, more sustainable, and are ultimately more impactful for everyone. They allow us to imagine and create a possible future that we all want to participate in. So I'm curious to kind of dive into a little bit more about the how behind your work. So the first question I have for you is, how did you kind of secure the resources, whether it was funding, staffing, or even decision-making power to make the Women of Color Design Council not just symbolic, but truly impactful at pivotal ventures?
So I talked a little bit about that, but the key here is the all of the work that went into really building a base, or use the word foundation, building a base and foundation for the environment to be prepared for them to make the decision in the first place, to understand how much a Women and Girls of Color Design Council was needed, was necessary. So part of it was there was I had worked on the adolescent mental health portfolio, so I could embed equity in that. So that's like the
Mhm.
first step. But also, there was a significant amount of resources being put into women and all women's power and influence. So, just looking that on the surface and there was heavy investment into all women's power and influence. But we know that when you focus on the all, we all want to believe it's all, but unless we take measured steps to really focus on the intersections of gender, race, disability, you don't get to the all.
Mhm.
So it was really taking a step back and really digging in and assessing what that all represented and what is the targeted universal system that needed to be in place to ensure that we were really talking about all. And so that is how I had to, I mean, it didn't happen because I asked politely. It happened because I had to build a strategic case grounded in both values and pragmatism, because I had to position myself as somebody who could deploy significant resources effectively within my position at Pivotal. By the time I championed the Design Council, I was a director of program strategy and investment, and I had already done a portfolio around adolescent mental health. So I already controlled significant decision-making authority over where money flowed.
Mhm.
But I had the positional power to allocate resources. I still had to, power on paper means nothing without strategic deployment. So I had to build the business case in language that funders understand. I had to demonstrate the cost of the status quo. Going with the status quo, we talk about that all. The risk to just doing the all without doing the deep analysis, intersectional analysis,
Mhm.
right? And I had to explain that the people best positioned to tell us where the gaps are, what's working and what's failing, and where that catalytic investment is, are women and girls of color who are directly impacted. And they're the leaders themselves. And it is that demonstration of the cost, the risk, and it's also it is really impossible to turn away once you see that, right? It's impossible to turn away without revealing values. Like, if you position something as both morally necessary and strategically smart, it really, you can't turn away from that. So, and then I had to secure the staffing by, I couldn't ask for new resources. I had to restructure the team that I had. I had to facilitate, how do you do a community-led design rather than doing this design in isolation. So it was like, it's not additional work. It's different but better work. And I had to bring in external facilitators. And I knew that there were going to be a lot of institutional pressures to try to dilute or co-opt the design council. So the way that we built it is that the design council members had governance that gave them authority, not just advisory input. But as I said, it started as advisory and they had to be trusted
Mhm.
through the process. They determined what success looked like. And that was really important. As I mentioned before, like this type of philanthropic liberation work can't be done alone. And it certainly can't be done, as I said, from inside. So we had to also invite allies to come in and help us. And I did invest heavily in my relationships with movement leaders. The Design Council came together through a lot of the organizations that we supported who told us about other organizations and leaders in the movement space. And I think these were trusted individuals, but I also think that not everybody trusted me in the design council. Like we were bringing together people who didn't know each other and people who did know each other. We were bringing together funders, activists, practitioners, VC folks from every aspect of the work because it was really important when we're trying to transform systems
Mhm.
that we bring people from different systems together, which makes it intersectional, which makes it much more elevated in the design aspect. And these are leaders that I'd been learning from, but didn't know. And these are leaders that I trusted over the years. And so I think even while holding appropriate skepticism about large institutions, they came in anyway, and we had to build community, and they took the risk of this kind of engagement, and they trust was earned through consistently showing up, through resourcing their work even before the design council existed. We also compensated them for their time. That was very important as experts. And so I think that was really important. We also learned from each other. We learned from each other's failures and experimented, and we had to trust each other in that pot. And like I said, we paid people for their time. I really refute and refuse the nonprofit starvation model that expects people to, especially women of color, to do transformative work for free.
Mhm.
So I think it's just an ethical thing to do, and it's this work is valued. So that's sort of the how and the where and the what for of all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you so much for providing that context. I think my initial thought in asking that question was thinking about the kind of time frame of the launch of the design council and just thinking about your time at Pivotal Ventures generally recognize like, societally there was that movement towards supporting that all, women led ventures and just trying to bring more women into the fold of having more decision making power. And so I wanted to kind of get to your point that you mentioned of like we all want to believe that it is really going to be all, but if there aren't deliberate measures to ensure that all women across differences of race, class, ethnicity, gender, disability status, all of the above, if they are not deliberate efforts to ensure that everyone is included and everyone has what they need to effectively be able to contribute to the decisions that are being made so that like that quote unquote all women can be a part of the division of solutions that we want to see. I think that's what I was kind of curious about hearing about. And so I think I love that you spoke to that. And then also what you talked about in terms of trust being really important in the how across the board of developing trust with those that you were, convincing that like this is important and this is something that we need, but also in terms of the development of the design council, but also with the women and girls of color that were coming on and sitting on the design council and ensuring that we trust you as experts and we recognize that you are experts and we're going to compensate you for your time because you deserve that. And there is that trust of like, we trust what you're bringing to the table is valuable because you are inherently valuable. So like I think neglecting to mention that trust piece would have been remiss. And so I'm so glad that you brought it up. And I think it's something that needs to also just be thought of more broadly in business and in entrepreneurship and just in teamwork and collaborative settings in general, that there needs to be that mutual trust because the solutions or completing a task, whatever it is not going to be done in the most effective way if there isn't that trust there. So, with all of that being said, the last question that I have for you is what advice might you offer to someone with an entrepreneurial mindset and desire to do impactful work and make a change in their community?
Yeah, I think, first of all, being an entrepreneur is not for the faint of heart. And I support and really just embrace anybody who is doing that. And I think entrepreneurs are just change makers in the world. And I think you have to transform any kind of rage that you have into a clear vision of what you're building towards and what does liberation actually look like in your context, and be specific. I think you have to build your analysis before you build your solution. I think a lot of people jump to what we should do before deeply understanding why the problem exists and be intersectional about that. Study systems, understand history, learn from those who've been doing this work for generations. There is a lot of times I would think that there's nothing new under the sun, but I think the innovation is applying and adapting to what some communities have already been doing or have always known. And you cannot find your people because you can't do this work by yourself. And you shouldn't try. Like, identify people who share your values and vision and build genuine relationships, not transactional networks, right? Invest time in trust building. And the relationships will sustain you when times get hard, and they will. And then they amplify you when whatever you need to become possible. And think carefully about where you can have the most leverage. I think that, is it inside institutions? Is it outside? I think I've spent the majority of my time as an entrepreneur working to understand when am I an inside person? When am I an outside person? There's no right answer, honestly. I think
Hmm.
your position may change over time. Mine has, and that's fine. I've been on both sides. I've also been on a lot of boards. I've been a consultant. I've been inside foundations. I've been worked in the field and in humanitarian aid. So it just depends. And I think it is also really important to speak different languages. In that sense, I mean the language of communities and movements, as well as business and corporations, right? Because I think it helps to speak those both languages, like the frameworks, the analysis, and the priorities. And because it helps you and speak business and impact metrics and risk management, I think you need to do both because you're not compromising your values. It means being strategic about the translation. You're building bridges, and bridges require understanding both sides. And being a bridge builder is so important, and it will serve both impact and for anything you're trying to do. Just make sure you compensate yourself, pay yourself, and pay yourself well. Figure out what you need financially, emotionally, physically to sustain this work long term,
Hmm.
because you got to build sustainability into your model and extend the same thing with whoever you work with.
Hmm.
Embrace failure. I would say embrace failure as information. You're going to try things that don't work. Lots of things are going to fail. People will disappoint you. Institutions will resist. That's not evidence at all. It is not evidence that your idea is crap. It is evidence that transformation is not impossible. It's data about what needs to be adjusted.
Yeah.
So just keep curious and keep learning. Protect your joy most of all, because this is going to take everything you have and it'll ask for more. And you have to be deliberate about what sustains you. And joy is the number one thing that you have to protect. And especially right now, this is where I am talking about, like, imagination and joy and creativity. Those are the three things that you have to continue to seek out, keep at the forefront, because you're going to play the long game. It
Hmm.
doesn't happen in grant cycles or quarterly reports. You are going to be building something that you may not see in your lifetime, right? So that's okay. You're planting seeds, you're shifting culture, you're creating conditions. You got to trust the process, even if the immediate things are not, the immediate results might not be ultimately visible immediately.
Yeah.
And you're not a savior. Everybody
Yes.
you're working with, everybody doesn't need saving. So they just need resources, access, power, and you're facilitating that process.
Yeah.
So be a good accomplice, co-conspirator, stay accountable, check your ego, center the leadership of those most impacted, and don't be a hero. It's about collective liberation.
Yeah, no notes. Like that is like the most like comprehensive piece of advice I think I've ever on this podcast so far, but also that I've ever heard in relation to thinking about entrepreneurship, that it's about thinking about the problem, not just and making sure you fully understand the problem and not just wanting to create a solution. You have to understand both the, how to communicate the problem from that business perspective, like you mentioned, but also through the frameworks and the language that the communities that you are building with can relate to and understand. And then also, that idea of creating that it's about relationship building, whether it's with the communities that you are building your solution with, or with, relationships with people that you're bringing on to help you from the business side if you don't have that experience. But it's also relationships outside of your entrepreneurial venture to ensure that you can prioritize your joy and create that sustainability to ensure that you can play the long game, because entrepreneurship is not, like you said, for the faint of heart, and it's not about instant gratification. So with all of that in mind, thank you so much for coming on today. This was such a wonderful conversation. I learned so much, and I know that our listeners will too. So I just want to say again, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I
Of
appreciate it.
course. Yeah. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast. The Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast was founded, hosted, and produced by me, Kelen Tamurian, president of the We Lead Student Board, with support from the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship and the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. I'm so grateful to have you along for these conversations, amplifying the stories of impact-minded women and gender-expansive innovators whose ventures and life's work shine a bright light on the radical possibility of entrepreneurship as an engine for positive social impact. If you'd like to learn more about the entrepreneur or leader featured in this episode, their journey, business, and mission, be sure to check out their website and social media platforms, all linked in the show notes. There you'll also find a list of the statistics, articles, and resources mentioned in this conversation for your further research and exploration. To stay connected with the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast and the Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Program at the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Washington, follow us on social media and visit our website, both linked below. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and share the podcast with a friend, classmate, or fellow believer in the power of entrepreneurship to spark positive change. Your support truly means the world and is the best way to help grow the show. I'm so happy you're here and part of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise community. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.